morning and welcome to Returning to Work, Legal and Practical Considerations webinar. Joining James Reed of Dinsmore is Steve Dion of Dion Leadership. This webinar should last about an hour and it will be recorded. We will send you a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint later today. We have also received SHRM credit for those of you that need that. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them via the chat and I will get them and send them to the presenters for answering. With that, I'll turn it over to James and Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Feel free to make this as interactive as possible. We want to tailor our presentation to your questions and, make this fun. Feel free to share your advice and your thoughts as well. As you can see, I'm coping with COVID-19 by growing my first ever mustache and looking forward to hearing how you're coping with COVID-19. As far as brief background, Dinsmore & Scholl is a national law firm. We have 28 offices coast to coast, and I am located in Ann Arbor and Troy, Michigan, are where my offices are, and really looking forward to today's presentation. And I will be talking more on the legal side of what everyone needs to look out for, and Steve will talk about the leadership side and emotional side that everyone needs to be cognizant of. So I'll pass the mic to my good friend and colleague, Steve Dion.
Thanks, James. Yes, James and I have known each other for a long time, and when we put this together, we thought both of these elements are really relevant to talk through. Dion Leadership is a leadership development and OD firm. So on our side, what we're seeing as we work with individual leadership coaches, coaching assignments, training programs, all the back to work issues that are on more the social and emotional side of this. The last few months have been absolutely crazy, as we all know, and we thought that we were right at a point now where talking about these return to work items, it's a particular time, and we're trying to build an HR community here. I know that James and I have spent a lot of time also looking out at the broader marketplace and landscape, and there's lots of webinars and topics that are going on. So we appreciate you spending some time with us today, but we wanted to take more of a local approach and share with you what we're seeing in our local communities. So particularly what we wanted to cover today is really to equip you with additional information and perspectives on how to navigate moving back to work. And what does this mean short term? What do we think this means long term? Give you some information, give you some data, and share best practices. We encourage you to use the chat feature, by the way, and we'll stop and answer those during this broadcast and try to create a dialogue and just be helpful with each other about where this is going. Wanted to start though, as we work with our clients, I have to say that the state of the HR function is so different. I personally come out of HR before getting into leadership development and coaching and consulting. And I have to applaud HR professionals for what they've gone through in the last 3 months. I know many times we've had these conversations about HR having a seat at the table, not being seen as an administrative function. Well, the call to step up happened, and everybody I've talked to has risen to that occasion. They have been indispensable in this time of crisis and have helped organizations from a functional perspective work with whatever came up in each individual day. The challenge now, though, we think, is how do you keep that momentum going? How do we move from being a trusted partner in a time of chaos to solve and put some band-aids on to staying as a seat at the table and helping executives and leaders deal with this in the long haul? And we'll talk about that today and how we think we can help with that. But before we get into that, we really also wanted to pause and just say, this is on top of everything else that we're dealing with right now. The events that have happened with the unfortunate treatment of George Floyd and the social injustice movement that we have that are going on in our country right now is just yet one more priority to add on to your list of things to deal with. This pandemic, I personally think that it's spurred the ability and need for us to have this conversation as an organization. This could be a whole nother webinar, which we may do in another week or two, who knows? But at this point, we just wanted to pause and say, this is relevant. And the topics we're talking about today in terms of the leadership and legal side of getting back to work will be resident, and I think can apply to how we think about responding to this as well. James, any other thoughts on that before we move on?
I would just say that the theme with COVID-19 and in general in the workplace is safety first. So we need to make sure our employees feel safe and feel like they're fairly treated and have a perception of diversity and inclusion. And actually, we can't just create perceptions and lead by example. We actually have to take action. So we have to take systematic action to make change, because change will not just automatically happen on its own soon enough as needed. So I'm already seeing many CEOs sending messages both internally and externally on what their plans are to actually take next steps and immediate action. So I really think now is your time to help your CEO draft a statement of what action you will be taking in order to continue to make things safer and better and more productive in your workplace. And from a legal perspective, we need to understand, I'm seeing a huge increase in claims, not with the smoking gun, hey, someone was terminated because of their race, religion, protected class. I'm seeing that person was terminated and we don't understand why. It seems unfair. It seems like they were singled out, and maybe it was because of an unconscious bias. So with respect to COVID-19, when you're deciding who to furlough or who to bring back to the front line, we need to make sure we're not taking into account any unconscious bias. Are we allowing people that have kids or have compromised immune systems to get certain treatment over others, certain races, certain treatment over others? We have to solely focus on job duties and the job and not take all this external, potentially protected class information into account. So unconscious bias is just as illegal as intentional discrimination. So we should make sure that we're having neutral reasons of how we're selecting our staff to be promoted or excluded, so it doesn't expose us to legal claims.
And as we talk through this hour today, you'll see that one of the trends and things that we're seeing is the importance of human connection and social and emotional skills, and that plays into how we're going to respond to this social justice movement as well. So let's start with some data before we move any further. So as it relates to COVID-19, there have been some great studies, and this is one you can take a look at deeper, but this Pulse of HR study by Josh Bersin and Sloan MIT has said that HR departments are seeing these as the most important things. Probably not surprising to you, things like job security, legal issues, continuity, but unlike other downturns, if you think about 2008, I have to say health and well-being in those studies at that time, way low on the list. Organizations weren't thinking about as greatly the impact that it had on the employee. We've evolved in a great deal related to that. And then managing remote work. I'm sure everybody sees that in their own world, but understanding what that means and looks like. These are the things that the HR community are saying have been front and foremost of mind as we've been going through the last couple of months. On the employee side, what are employees saying? Realizing that we are also employees, as are our leaders as we go through this. But the most important thing for them, similar to the organization being concerned with their finances, the employee is concerned with their finances and with their job security. That is probably not surprising as well. We're all sharing, as is the employee, the well-being and health issues related to themselves, and workers and workforces having to step up to own responsibility for not just physical safety, but other safety in the workplace. And we'll talk more about that. Family is a really important element, and we're seeing that really progressive organizations are taking a stance on that as well, and helping organizations through, or employees through, their processes and programs think about what are the employee issues related to having kids that are at home. Where's your spouse in this situation? What issues do you have in terms of your ability to work remotely? And last on the employee's mind is production and work. And I think what's interesting about this is, while we would like to think that, the employee thinks of that first, until they go through those first 3 items, they can't even get there. I'm sure they want to be more as productive as they can, but unless you feel like you're physically safe and you have well-being, it's really hard to stay focused on work. And we're going to spend time today really talking about how do we help the employee be more productive through these leadership and legal considerations. So we thought we'd stop right here, and Autumn's going to initiate a poll. We just wanted to get a sense from you and take about 20 seconds here, 20, 30 seconds to answer the question here. But what are your most pressing issues right now? Let's get a sense to see where we're at today compared to some of this national data. So thank you. That's information's coming in.
We know that all of the above is probably wanted by many, but we strategically limited you to one choice.
Pick the most important, please. Yeah.
And there is no wrong answer.
Okay. Shall we get this closed? Let's see what we see. Okay, interesting. So tied with the top 2 as well. So financial health, cash flow in the organization is still a primary issue, and health and well-being of employees. You know, I can appreciate that reskilling and the new, we're not there yet. I think that's what that says to me as well. So some of the things we can talk about is how we get prepared to deal with those things. So as we get through today, that'll help us kind of guide the conversation that we can have. Good. So here's what we do know based on this. We do believe that the workforce won't be the same through this. So here's the opportunity that we see you have. And I love this quote, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. When this first started, what we were hearing from our clients is, you know, this is a timeout, this is a pause, you know, let's stop doing these things and we'll get back to where we were in a couple of weeks or months. As this is unfolded, we believe and we think you should get your mindset around work won't be the same. Really ever again. You know, there's been new developments in the world, just like when the internet came in or we were able to, you know, get on an airplane and travel, it changes the way we work. Well, this is going to change how we work forever. So it's a great time to think about it, not just what we need to do short term to get back to work, but the longer term vision here is, you know, to redefine your culture and transform the way you work and reinvent talent. So what does that look like? You know, we didn't want to give you specific tips and you know, kind of random sets of things that we're seeing, but the bigger buckets of items to think about. And we're going to go through the first 4 of these as we unpeel this back today. First is physical safety. That is, of course, a primary focus right now. The well-being of employees. James is going to spend some time next deep diving into that. But from there, we want to get into the psychological safety of this. What does it mean when you've gone through a trauma, when changes, you know, as a community, we've had this, and people are just now considering what this means. And we want to talk about that in the context of how we do that is through human connectedness. And we're seeing this whole idea of, you know, CEOs being now chief empathy officers. What some of the things that we're hearing is having the, you know, the goal and leadership of connecting people to this common purpose and putting employees in the forefront. And then the most exciting part, I have to say for me, is sort of rethinking these sacred cows that have been out there. And we'll talk about whether those are specific leadership competency areas or programs or policies. And we'll give you a couple of examples of those. And just want you to take something out of today is, what are your sacred cows in the organization that it's a perfect time to label, look at, and potentially rethink with some possibility thinking here. You know, organizations are thinking very differently than they were a year ago. They're producing products that they weren't producing before. They're, you know, working from home where they never thought they could. So this is a great time to look at these different items. So let's keep going and move into the physical safety elements.
Great, and thanks for the 54 attendees on today's webinar. For those of you that came on after the intro, I'm James Reed, attorney at Dinsmore, a national law firm, and I'm here with Steve Dion of Dion Leadership. And this session is approved for SHRM credit, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please include your questions in the chat box. And Steve, we just got our first question as to, what are the new normal changes that companies should be considering? And one company is changing their 9-box, evaluation to something new. Right now, leaders need more 360 kind of feedback as to, is it working? Are they communicating enough, not communicating enough? And are we able to think outside of the box and acknowledge our employees that are going above and beyond, like HR is taking on responsibilities that are outside of their job description. So we really should brainstorm new ideas to get that feedback and evaluations this year. It seems almost not empathetic enough to just give them a 9-box statistic and not have more personal touch.
Right, and the criteria of what's in that 9-box is really important today. Prioritizing what it means to be agile, to have social and emotional skills, to work remotely. Those might not have been criteria a year ago that were important for leader success. So we'll speak a little bit to this later as well, and we can come back to this question.
Sure. So going to the first element is physical safety. And this is near and dear to my heart. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and every time I go to their school, the first rules are how to be safe. And the same rules apply to every company. We want employees to feel like they have job security. We want employees to be acknowledged that, they're not going to have physical danger or imminent death or substantial bodily harm. That's the whole concept of the Occupational Safety Health Act. We want employees to feel comfortable so that they can have what I call healthy conflict. We want them to share their ideas for change, how to make the workplace better. And what I'm going to be covering in about the next 10 slides is a checklist of how to make sure you're identifying certain elements to make sure you're safe. And rather than me just guess what are the safety elements, Governor Whitmer in Michigan actually requires us to have certain safety measures in place to have employees back to work. And there are additional requirements for certain industries, such as manufacturing, construction, laboratories, retail, food and beverage, and healthcare. Just to give you an example, if you wanted to see the doctor now, you're supposed to have a policy and a plan where patients can wait in the car and get a text message to come into the workplace and maybe sign in from their phone so they don't have to use that dirty pen. So just be creative. A lot of this is common sense, and we don't want to just be doing the bare minimum. We, in addition, want to tailor it to our clientele. Next slide. So the requirements of the governor order are two parts. One, you have to have a plan. So you're going to develop your COVID-19 plan. This is where HR can step up and show that they're ready for this plan. And this is where you need to appoint a team. You can't do all of this by yourself. HR needs to work with the CFO, CEO, and identify the industry expert to develop your plan that's actually required to be in place the later of June 1st, so 4 days ago, or within 2 weeks after resuming your in-person work. And we have to designate one or more supervisors that will be in charge on site. You can't just be supervising remotely to make sure that we are following the plan. And in addition to having this great plan, we can't assume like we're in compliance because we have a 75-page handbook and maybe add a COVID-19 plan to it. We actually have to provide mandatory training. And your mandatory training has to follow at least 4 steps. Your workplace infection control practices, how to use your personal protective equipment, what steps you have to do to report anyone that was exposed to COVID-19, whether it's customers, contractors, employees, and how to communicate on any unsafe working conditions. I'm getting the questions like, right now, Steve and I are in the workplace and we are not wearing a mask, as you can see, but if we were going to the restroom, it would be unprofessional or potentially in violation to not have a mask with us if in that hallway we could be crossing somebody, within less than 6 feet of space, or going to the bathroom where someone else may also be in that public space. So we want to make sure that we are having, protocols and monitoring best practices. In addition, when Steve and I are, coming to work, we have to self-test and represent that we don't have a fever. So whether you're having a temperature screening when you enter the workplace, or you're getting your temperature check at home, when I log into my computer, I actually have to certify that I don't have a fever or other symptoms. And we also have to have a cleaning mechanism. So we have to supply the hand sanitizer, the wipes, and other basic, mechanisms to make sure we are not all touching the same, key entry to access the premises or enter our time. And in addition, we need to have on speed dial our local public health department, and also be able to communicate with our employees and contractors when there's an issue. And in addition, we have to be aware of our local county ordinance. So many counties are having additional requirements of certain postings you have to have on the outside of your premises, and what you can and can't do when screening employees. And what I'm seeing a huge increase of are employees saying, I'm afraid to come back to work. I'm fearful. I have a compromised immune system, or I have a child or a spouse that has a compromised immune system, and I don't want to come back, and I believe I can do my job fine remotely. Let me stay remote. So in that regard, be aware there are over 100 executive orders in Michigan, and Executive Order 36 prohibits the discharging or retaliation for an employee who is at particular risk of infecting others. So we don't want to retaliate against any other employees as well. What we can do is let them know that if they refuse suitable work, that may be a disqualification from unemployment, or we may have to accommodate them with unpaid leave if they are unable to come to work.
Hey, James, one timely question that just came in, and we'll keep going through the questions and look at some at the end, but specifically related to this, what are the requirements of record retention of no fever certification?
If there's no fever, you're not necessarily required to have any records of it. And ideally, you want to maintain confidentiality of those that you are screening. But if there is a positive case, then you would need to have your records, and you would need to inform the local public health department and any employee. So really, there's no record requirements unless there's a positive test. However, you would at a minimum want to publish your plan so that you are in compliance with requiring employees to self-check and customers at a minimum. Next slide. And this goes without saying, I had numerous calls where on Memorial Day weekend, everyone was having their 100-person barbecue outings and taking pictures with other people. And if you see that, even though we don't have a duty to monitor people's private lives, we can't be an ostrich with our head in the sand. So if you see people that are violating our plan and our requirements, you may need to make sure they are 72 hours symptom free before they return to the premises. You want to restrict business related travel that's only essential, encourage employees to use their PPE. And still, even though as of June 4th, retail opened up, and on Monday, restaurants and bars are opening up. Hopefully, maybe I'll see somebody outside. And even though that's the case, to the extent you are still able to do all of the essential job functions remotely, I would encourage you to consider that and make sure that you are being reasonable in how you are, instructing your employees to interact to the community. And this is just an additional checklist of things to consider. Like right now, I'm able to enjoy the office coffee pot, but if everybody was back to work, it really wouldn't be sanitary to have multiple people touching the same, coffee handle, unless we had some protocol in place of using gloves or paper towel. And likewise, you may want to turn off your water fountain. You may want to have relocate some of your office equipment to encourage social distancing and continue to have face shields or space out employees to make sure we can, safely stay at least 6 feet apart. And we want to continue to remind employees of personal hygiene. I see people getting too comfortable. People are not wearing undergarments to work, no bras. They're being too lax in their clothing because they're not necessarily interacting with customers. This may be a good time to also remind employees of our other policies involving appearance and hygiene. And we want to, continue to send people home if there's any perception that they may be symptomatic.
So the good news in this, I think, is employee studies have shown that they actually have a higher trust in their employer right now to keep them safe and to tell them the right things than they do over other institutions in their life right now. And people have stepped up and they've really responded well. We see to these physical safety items to say we do care about that. But the psychological elements are really as important. And I think organizations are just getting to that. So really quickly, from a neuroscience perspective, why is psychological safety important? And this might be helpful for you as you talk to your leaders who might say this seems really touchy-feely. But what happens in a time of threat or trauma? And we've been through a trauma as an organization and as individual people. As trauma comes first, there's level 1 threat. You see something in the broad environment, gee, that bothers me, it concerns me, I might talk about it. There's very little physical effects of that. There's a tornado somewhere else, now all of a sudden that tornado's in your neighborhood. Oh my gosh, my heart's racing a little bit, my blood's going up. I'm really attentive to it. I'm changing some of my behaviors. That's level 2 threat. And level 3 threat is, it is upon me. I look out the window and I see it. Now I have a physiological response to that. I can't think right. The blood's rushing to my brain. I can't breathe. Your employees and your leaders are in different stages of this threat level. And it was originally, and people might bounce back and forth depending on what's going on over the last few months. But using this as a way, we talked about the 9-box and succession plan in a question earlier, using this level of threat as a way to gauge where your leaders are individually. And it might be in somebody's neighborhood now, it might not be. And they might toggle between level 3 and 2. And when you're in 3, physically, it's hard to respond to that. So what happens in a trauma? 3 things happen. You fall down the stairs, right? Easy trauma. First, there's a shock. I'm fine. I didn't hurt myself. I'm going to get up. You're not even thinking correct. Pain next comes after trauma. We've been in pain. And you might not acknowledge it in a situation like this and even know it with employees, but it is an important part to realize that pain comes after shock. And you can't rehabilitate until that pain has subsided to a point where you can then go to PT, if I keep using that example, and re-strengthen muscles, rethink of new strategies on how you might cope with the world. So thinking of this from a neuroscience perspective is really important. And why is that important? Well, we need to think deeply right now as leaders to solve problems. We have new problems that require very deep thinking. You can't think deeply when you have fear that's caused stress. It's just hard to do. And psychologically and from a neuroscience perspective, your brain doesn't allow you to do that. So our job as leaders, as HR professionals, is to wrestle down that threat level, to help people think through what's manageable, what can we do today, how to provide safety, whether that's providing, team, events, and we'll talk through that a little bit as well. But as we go through, but we will be better served if we can help our employees reduce their stress level through the trauma that's been created, and understanding that each person's at a different place in this. So where is this for leaders? So, this is a list of questions that you might want to ask yourself. And what we're seeing right now is, a leader is dealing with this as much as a trauma as anybody else. They're an employee. So our job is to help them first be in a great place with less threat level so they can be there for their employees in turn, and help close the gap on uncertainty, on risk, help them feel safe, so they can show up and be the best that they can be. the need for social and emotional skills right now, I think, has never been higher. We've been talking about this for a while. You know, people have said artificial intelligence is going to come in, so we won't need that more. And the studies have actually shown we need that greater. On top of that, now with this pandemic and this need, helping employees and leaders understand how to unpack very uncomfortable conversations for people that aren't about, you know, did you get this task done? It's really critical, and it's a new world for leaders. We're seeing many organizations say, I don't know how to manage when I don't see my employee. You know, I see a butt in a seat. I know what that means. I see them at their computer. What do I do now? How do I manage this? So you might want to look at these 6 items and think about where's each leader, and help close the gap with each of these things as you think about helping them get ready for continuing to lead. And this, again, isn't a short-term thing. This is going to happen for a while. So when some people go back to the office and some are home, that's a whole nother challenge of how do I lead where we're all not in the same boat. We're all in different boats. How do we use technology? You know, should I be vulnerable with my employee? You know, am I supposed to be strong and say, this is what you should do? Am I supposed to be vulnerable and say I'm freaking out today? Leaders are not sure where to go. And then you add social media on top of it and the frenzy that brings with the stress level it brings to each individual person. And, you know, then the leader starts to complain to their employees, and they're negative and they're not sure what to do. And then that creates more stress and reaction to the employee base, who then can't think properly. And it really comes back down to the good old tried, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, you know, it's interesting to bring this up after it's been around for, you know, almost 100 years now, I think. But, you know, last year we were at higher levels with this. Organizations were doing well, talking about self-actualizing and development, and, you know, a lot of esteem issues and great workplaces. We went down to physical safety needs in a second. And we're building back up. So as we just talked about physical needs, then we have safety needs. The next is belonging needs, and we're going to talk about that next in terms of social distancing. So we think we're at this belonging stage, and we're going to share now some of the tips and techniques for how to sort of stay there. And let's go back to the legal side from a social distancing perspective.
Sure. And just one quick question that came in was a little more discussion on unconscious bias, and that is extremely important. So the best way to summarize this is unconscious bias is just as illegal as intentional discrimination. And if there's a perception of bias, regardless if it's true, that's enough for an employee or an applicant to bring a claim. So in order to protect your organization, you actually need to have a diverse board or a diverse group of decision makers. So it's not solely one person in one protected class, the old white man, making all the decisions. Ideally, you'd have someone younger and older, a man, a woman, in different races, part of a selection committee to get rid of that perception of unconscious bias or favoritism based on potentially some protected class or not being part of a protected class. And with regard to social distancing, we need to stagger our times of who is coming to the office when to minimize overcrowding. And if you make all the women or minorities come in at the worst shift, that is creating a perception of unconscious bias that we need to eliminate. And if we allow certain protected classes to work remotely but not others, that would also expose our company to liability. So we need to also rethink about what we're going to do with our in-person events and our training. These virtual sessions will be the new normal, and if you're not investing in continued trainings, you're actually exposing your company to more liabilities by not having the trainings, because the first question asked by an EEOC investigator or a plaintiff attorney is what training did the decision makers have, if any. Next slide. And you know, let's just be smart. Let's increase our space to have a perception that we're not getting too close, and let's limit our visitors, how many people are in the elevator, how many are in a conference room, and just space things out. And then let's continue to Also stagger break times. Maybe you want to have certain people get the coffee pot at certain times. What's our new way to greet somebody? I was meeting with a realtor to look at other office space, and it was kind of awkward not to greet at all. I don't know if you do like a mime hello from a distance, or a fist bump, or you kick shoes and things of that nature. Make sure we're doing hands-free, no-touch payment options. I love my Apple Watch and my phone where I can pay things without touching anything. And let's continue to be creative in what barriers we may be implementing. And let's have posters. It goes back to the first grade, encourage employees to wash hands and continue to make sure anyone is wiping down doorknobs whenever there's an interaction with the public or another employee. And we have to continue the face coverings. I am getting disability accommodation requests, such as what happens if I'm claustrophobic, or I can't breathe with this face covering, or I just have a fear, or I have some skin rash. We need to be flexible in allowing employees to still provide safety, yet accommodate a potential disability. So we can allow people to have the material of the covering of their choice, or have other creative ways to balance all the other 10 employment laws that are still always in effect. And make sure that we are, for banks or other special industries, you don't want to have the fear of PTSD when you think you're going to get robbed because someone's coming in with a mask. So just use your common sense. You may briefly ask someone to remove their mask for identification purposes, and also make people feel safe.
So we thought we'd take a quick pause here, and everybody might appreciate where other organizations are at. So we're going to do another quick poll. When will most of your workforce be back in the physical office space? So you have everywhere. Please answer this in the next few seconds. Everywhere from we're already all there down to we don't plan to have a majority back again. Okay, I'll give it just a couple more seconds here. Okay, let's see what we got. Oh, interesting. So 12% already there, 27 in the summer, which is, we're hearing a lot about that. We're hearing a group say, let's just not plan to go back till after school starts again, but 35% say we don't plan to have the majority back to work. So let's talk about what that means in terms of how we're going to operate in a new normal here. Employee and visitor screening.
Yes, so essentially, if you're not having a majority of your staff back to work, how are you going to be interacting with your employees or your visitors? We need to figure that out. And you may need to talk to your landlord and find different space. Either your same size space may be sufficient if you're going to space things out more, or you may be able to obtain a smaller space. But I think there will still be some element of employees and visitors at the workplace. So you want to make sure that you have screening in place to make sure someone doesn't have a fever, but also make sure that you're being confidential with respect to if they do have a fever. You don't want to say the name of the person that does and share that customer's or that employee's private medical information. And if you have employees that speak different languages, maybe have alternative signs posted as well. And make sure that you are having other procedures, and be mindful of security. How are you going to keep the premises secure if people are no longer using your PIN entry devices? And how can you minimize customers from having to touch the door handle and sign in or check in? And the time clock is particularly important for employees. How are they going to track time, and are you paying them for all time worked? We'll cover a little later. There's about 10 employment laws that are commonly being violated related to COVID-19. And one of them is, wage and hour laws. Are you paying employees for all time worked remotely? And are you paying them for this training time if they're watching this webinar or doing other training? So make sure you make it clear that employees should report all time worked.
So the third element we mentioned, or a theme that we're seeing, is this human first connection. Connection to employees, connection to customers, vendors, society. I'm sure you, like all of us, have had a ton of emails from, whether it's Delta Airlines about we care about you, or your mortgage company. I just got a phone call today from FedEx saying, we know it's tough times, how can we help support you differently? I'm like, I didn't think I had a need, but it was a reach out to our main line from FedEx. So this is real. It's something to build on. It's not going away. This list here is, we offer this as a short-term list of items to consider for a human first connection. I think we could come back and talk deeper about what does this look like in the future, but at least as it relates to the short-term getting back to work, a couple things to think about. To an earlier question we had, we actually recommend here, complete a talent audit of leaders to understand where they're at on those 3 levels of threat we talked about, where they're at from their personal situations, their unique strengths that they might bring to the job that you might not have thought about before. We realize it's a daunting task to go through every employee, but take some time and do an inventory of where your leaders and employees are and have those conversations with them if you're not already doing that. Second, and we are seeing this to some degree already done really well, is leading large-scale staff education and communication events. We see communication activities being ramped up very well with organizations, CEO messages, video talks. We suggest, though, to move that from just communication events, which are one way, we care about you, here's what we're doing, there you go, to a two-way dialogue and education activities. How we have that connection is people being able to talk into small group events. Some of our clients are working in small group activities where it's really important for them to kind of dialogue back and forth. The broad-based training activities are really important here, I think. As James mentioned, teaching about technology, teaching about these new skills and mindsets are really important. And then for those individual leaders that are really key to the organization's success, lean into coaching and providing ways for them to lead better or differently in the way that we work in the organization. And one particular way to think about managing this and doing this differently is resiliency. Resiliency is not something that we could get organizations to think about a long time ago. Maybe it was stress management, but our time to help organizations and people realize that strong leaders have resiliency. And resiliency is an acquired ability to regularly recover and adapt and grow from stress. One of the things that we're learning in the research is this isn't just innate. People can build this as a muscle. So we suggest now you teach this. We've had it in our catalogs for a while on a one-on-one coaching perspective. We're forever coaching a C-level executive. They've dealt with stress and trauma and business issues all the time on a one-on-one level, but now you guys, you're doing this on a global level. All leaders need to have an ability to understand and help realize when their emotions are having them hooked. And there's a specific model, which I won't get into now, but there's some really strong strategies and ways I think you can really manage this. What you could do immediately, though, without skills and training is, for your leaders, provide employees an opportunity to talk about the pandemic, not just have meetings and status meetings, but how is this affecting you? Have some real, raw conversations. Get to the emotional impact. People feel more comfortable when they know they're not alone, when others are like, wow, I didn't know you were feeling this way. I've been really concerned about coming back to work. You know, having leaders and equipping leaders with a requirement to have these conversations. All leaders, not just leaders that are good people leaders, but dialoguing better and discussing plans to come back to work. There are very specific training opportunities. You can see some on our website even about building resilience as a program. But even if you don't teach it directly, being able to say to leaders, that's the next step on this. We've moved from communication activities. Now let's move into talking about you as a person and the impact that this has on you. And I don't want to go into this, but this World Happiness Report is something you may want to consider. And this just supports, it's just new findings. It's a report that comes out all the time, but it's showing that happiness is coming primarily from social support and freedom to pursue life on your own terms. And so we need that. And when we're going to be working remotely, having long-term plans for creating social support when you're not, you know, a cubicle wall over from somebody is going to continue to be a challenge. So I think there's some good findings in this. I just wanted to put it in here. This could be a whole nother hour to talk about in terms of happiness, but maybe we'll get to that. On the sacred cow, the fourth one perspective, wanted to just share that this is a great example of that. One sacred cow has been, you know, and I know a lot of HR people have said, you know, we've been trying to get a telecommuting policy, work from home policy for years. Our CEO doesn't want to have it. People don't want to have it. We couldn't possibly do it. C-level teams thought, sacred cow broken. We can all work from home. We figured it all out. Everything didn't crumble. We're seeing reports of people that are working even better working from home. Here's another sacred cow, though, we think you should bust, is data shows that when done right, virtual learning is actually more effective. It might not be as enjoyable, but it's more effective than face-to-face learning. So we're going to need to get into this world of teaching virtually, not just self-paced or blended learning, but video learning. I know with us, a lot of our clients, we do a lot of high potential executive leadership programs, and they like to fly people in, get into a hotel, meet face-to-face. They're really having trouble letting go of learning in that environment. And what we know from this study is how brains learn. If you want to create a new behavior, this AGES model, attention, generation, emotion, and spacing, is what gets people there. So here's a great example that you can say to your organization. Let's break our sacred cow of just waiting to do training until we're back in the office, because we're not going to be back in the office the same way. We need to upskill leaders and employees now with everything from technical skills to social and emotional skills, and lean into, and there's data that shows exactly what this looks like and how virtual training can actually be more effective. So that would be one example of a sacred cow I would bring up. I wanted to, you know what, in the instance of time, I think I'll not do this third poll, and if we get to it after, we can. But we really wanted to understand where you are at right now in the learning space. But I'll move on so we can have enough time for more questions. And last in this, before we turn over to the next section, is those are some short-term things. I'd suggest that you have about 6 to 12 months where mindsets are unfrozen to rethink a long-term roadmap before the organization gets back into some bad habits. So while we're tired, I think it's really important that we, you know, think about now as we get back, how do we keep the momentum going? And there's some sacred cows in the policy stage or kind of area, and James is going to speak to that.
Sure. And then Steve, the audience would like to see some of your backup data where they can show the organization how, you know, virtual learning can be more effective. So please share that.
Great. When we send out the recording of this, I'll send out, we'll include that as well.
So the great thing about policies is that they're always changing, and that's job security for HR. And all of you need to update not only your COVID-19 plan, but you probably need to change, you know, your related PTO and working remotely policy, and how does this overlap with all the other employment laws. So you need to, this is a great time when the world is slightly on pause to update all of your documents and procedures and make sure you're still protecting your confidential information when employees are working remotely. And I'll be relatively fast, next slide, because we have 10 more slides in about 10 more minutes. We also need to I think the most important training from a legal perspective is issue spotting training. It's not necessary for all of your employees to be experts in the law, but they do need to know how to spot issues to report to you. So people need to be aware of how to document safety issues. What I like to focus on is the 7 W's: who, what, where, when, why, what do you want, witnesses, and how are we, verifying that our employees are getting this information, and also what I call train the trainer. And you also want to have signed acknowledgments and receipts that they have completed this training. Next slide. And our closing thoughts is that we want to make sure you have a checklist of legal considerations. So let me just give you an example. Have you thought about OSHA? If you're using bleach or dangerous chemicals, you could be violating the Michigan OSHA requirements. Bleach is not allowed unless you have an eye washing station on the premises. Have you thought about the National Labor Relations Act? Are employees talking about their managers or how to improve safety and working conditions? That could be protected activity in a non-unionized environment. Are people talking about wage and hour or getting higher pay for their hazard work? Are people committing unemployment fraud? Do you know how to follow the PPP loan obligations that were just amended again 2 days ago? Do people know how to comply with Family First Coronavirus Response Act for paid FMLA or paid sick leave? Or do we know how to follow all the laws with remote work? And are we making sure that we're paying employees for this mandatory training that we require them to attend? Any break that is under 30 minutes for a lunch break must be paid, and any break that is under 20 minutes at work outside of lunch must also be paid. Next slide. So we want to also be mindful of all these discrimination laws. We're going to be treating some people differently than others, and maybe interviewing somebody virtually. And we may see, some religious icons in the background, or whether they have kids or other things. And we may be checking them out on LinkedIn and Facebook. We need to make sure our unconscious biases are not being factored in. And we want to continue the communication. As Steve said, we don't want this just to be a leadership dictation. We want to be interactive. So you have to find now's the best time to call your employees. How you doing? How are you feeling? What can I do for you? And customers. I would encourage you to reach out to your customers and vendors and just check in. Next slide.
Well, let me go back to on the leadership side and closing thoughts. Suggest that you double down on critically important skills right now. We can't do everything, but just don't gloss over the need to say, how will things be different? We're going to lead virtually for a long while. Don't just sort of teach that, do it really well. Become an organization that is known for leading people from wherever they are. Be an organization that's going to be known for being agile and resilient, that have leaders with strong emotional support skills. And then bring in policies and programs. One example I wanted to highlight here, you can see on the right, is IBM created a really interesting pledge for working from home. And so you can teach this, but support it with these OD documents and doctrines to say, here's how this will look. And we'd be happy to send that out with this as well as an example. I've already had one client adopt it for their organization in healthcare and say, this is what it's going to look like in terms of the person's social skills themselves on how they work from home and take time for themselves and not overwork, but also be present and just double down on those things that are probably going to continue to happen for the foreseeable future.
And on the legal side, we need to make sure that all job descriptions are updated if there's been any changes, because if anybody ever needs an accommodation or has a doctor's note, the doctor needs to be able to certify if they can or can't do the essential functions of the job. So this is a great time to protect yourself by updating the job description and also being empathetic and acknowledging all of the contributions employees are making above and beyond that should be added to their job description so they could be acknowledged and appreciated for their new responsibilities.
We have just 2 or 3 minutes left. If there's any additional questions, we can answer those, but wanted to be mindful of our time and realizing people may need to get to something else next.
And let's continue the dialogue. Feel free to reach out to us separately anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate the time that you spent with us. Good luck, stay healthy and safe yourself. And hopefully this is a great opportunity for you to continue to create great organizations. And
if there's anything else you want to have a panel to hear about, let either one of us know. We definitely want to tailor our discussion to what you're looking for.
Thanks, James and Steve. We had very helpful information. Everyone says they're thanking you very much for that, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, the SHRM certificate will be available in the materials link that'll come later this afternoon, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.